Morning, everybody. My name is Wallace, and I'm here to be the moderator of the Securing Access to Big Data forum. For those of you who thought I was a speaker, no, I'm the moderator, not the speaker. We've put this session together to kind of take a little bit of a different tact on big data. We're here to talk about the security, so we're going to give you a little different perspective. On my left is our panel members, and first off, on far left is Denise Mellor, and she's with the California Franchise Tax Board. She's also the Director of Privacy, Security, and Disclosure Bureau, which focuses on those aspects for businesses internationally. She has one of her friends and employee, Darlene here, who can also talk about access to big data, access and control to big data. Closest to me is Neal Puff. Neal works for Verizon now as a security solutions architect, but he was also the Yuma County Chief Information Officer. So he's going to be on our panel. And Duane Clouse is the Managing Principal for Identity and Access Management at Verizon. Oops, wrong way, sorry. This is going to be an interactive session. It's not going to be me standing up here lecturing to you. So feel free to ask questions from the audience, and we're going to direct them to the panel members, and we'll answer as best as we can. The top of this is a little bit cut off, but it basically says the top 10 security concerns according to the Cloud Security Alliance. And then everything from the big data sources, coming from smart meters, video, all kinds of other sources, all the way down to how that data is stored, how that data is accessed, how that data is controlled in the end, logging, stuff like that. So all those things are available to you, but we only have 50 minutes. So I could just define the problem for the next 50 minutes. So the basic thing that we want to do now is kind of focus on a couple of areas that we're talking about here. This is really the end of the slides. Everything from this point on is meant to be interactive. So I'm going to sit down here and direct the first question to kind of get things going, unless anybody has any starting questions. Don't be shy, okay? Everybody needs to. This is an interactive session, right? We can sit here and be quiet for the whole time if you want to. Nobody, okay.
I'm pretty sure I can't. So
okay. So Denise, how important is it to protecting your data sources and your big data implementation, stuff like that, and how do you control access to that data?
So is there anyone in the room that thinks it's not important to protect data? Just making sure you're listening. I think that's a critical component of anyone who's responsible for data, right? And I am a big proponent of starting with your foundational base, creating your policies and your procedures around data management. Otherwise, it kind of grows and grows and grows, and next thing you know, you've lost a little bit of control. And even if somebody asks you what to do with it, you don't necessarily know because you haven't had those conversations. So big proponent of understanding what data you need to do your job. How are you going to use it? How are you going to protect it? What's the value of that data? Who are you going to share it with? How are they going to protect it? Are you going to have an agreement with them? You should. Who's the data owner? Where did your data come from? So that you know, did you get it from someone else and are they the true owner? What are your reporting requirements if you have an issue with that data? Who do you have to tell? I'm throwing out a lot of questions in the effort to get you to think about what data you need and what you don't need. And there's another really important question is, as more and more data is available, a lot of us fall into the trap of, ooh, that data is available and I might need it, so I'm going to get that. Well, I really encourage you to understand what your business need is and make good decisions about whether or not you really need that data. Because number one, you don't want to pay to protect data that you don't need, right? It costs a lot of money. Some people say storage is cheap. I don't know that I believe that anymore when you have to put all the controls around it. So know what you need to do your job If you collect data because you think you're going to need it and then you find out later that you don't need it, get rid of it. So what does that mean? You need a data retention policy, right? So, and how do you dispose of that, and how do you do that appropriately? So for us, we're doing a big data project right now at the Franchise Tax Board. We have some of those policies in place, and I can tell you if we didn't, we would be having much more difficult time at figuring out how to collect the data, how to manage it, and so on. And even though we do have some data management policies in place, there are still questions that come up where we have to re-examine the policies that we have in place. Does that cover it? Does it not? Oh, didn't think about that. This field is growing so fast and the issues are growing so fast that sometimes we have to change those up. So critical to know what data you need, how you're going to protect it, who you're sharing it with, and what your exposures are.
How do you vet a request from somebody who asks you to share that data with like another government agency?
So for my organization, we have a questionnaire process. So when we get a request to share data, they have to provide us with their need and use, if you will, for that data. Their business need for it, and they have to talk about how they're going to protect it, and so on and so forth. And then we use that questionnaire to make sure that, one, we have the data they want, right? Two, that we have the legal authority to share it. So I'm representing a tax agency. Other people have different data requirements for the data that they have. So it's important that you know what your organization's data management rules are. For us, again, we have to have the legal authority in the code section that says that we can share it with different organizations if it's confidential data. So that's the start. And then we go through and we evaluate whether or not they've answered a set of questions about how they're going to use the data, is it appropriate with how we've collected it, and so on. And then we can make some determinations about whether or not we believe they're at risk with our data. Then we follow that up once they have the data by doing safeguard reviews. So we actually visit their location and we make sure that they're protecting it in the manner that they've said that they're going to protect it and is appropriate underneath the law.
Okay. Sure.
So that's just sort of what I'm viewing as paperwork. You're going through that process, you're just kind of reviewing. But what are you actually doing to monitor that data so make sure it doesn't creep out anywhere?
With our partners that we're sharing with?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have a team who's responsible for doing safeguard reviews. And they actually go out, and in many cases, they'll spend a couple days with an organization, depending on the size of them and how much data they have and what data they have and so on. So remember going back to those rules and the policies around the data sharing, if that's really important, right? We need to keep track of who's got our data, what they're doing with it, where they're using it, and so on. And they will track the data from receipt to that organization all the way through the process, and how it's used, what systems it goes through, who actually has access to it, are they the appropriate people, in addition to looking at physical security controls for the facility and all of that as well. So they're actually tracking that data through those systems and doing some IT review as well.
Because internally, within an infrastructure, I can see the controls being easier to manage. But as soon as you start going into an interagency agreement, that's where I would lose sleep.
Right, and that's why it's really important that you have those interagency agreements, right? Not just say, oh, they're a well-known organization, or they're a good state organization that has good controls. You actually have to have an agreement with them that says, these are the things that you're going to do, and that you agree that we're going to come out and make sure that you're doing those things that you do. So we do that for our data sharing partners that are in the state, that have actual legal authority to have the data. And if we're using a business partner that's not a state organization, they have to agree to that too, or we don't use them. So you're welcome.
What about new certifications like accessibility or SSA?
Did you say what about those?
Yeah.
Those.
Your business partner already has that. Would you still require your side of
I have your tax information. Do you want me to accept that? No, we don't. It's a factor in the evaluation of whether or not they've got good controls. It would be something that we would look at. But we are still the data owner, and that data owner is still responsible for making sure that that data is used and protected in an appropriate manner, so we don't rely on those.
And something I would just add to that, you know, I think as with most security, at some point it comes down to a fundamental question of who do you trust and how do you verify that that trust is justified. And it's no different with big data than it is with a lot of other things. Whenever you're talking about sharing, there has to be at some very fundamental level some degree of trust, and that can be through SLAs, it can be through certifications, but it has to be appropriate for the level of sensitivity of that data. And I think that's important too, because you don't want to put massive controls on something that's basically public information. That's just a waste. Anyway.
Neal, how do you prevent disclosure of the privacy information that can be gleaned from big data?
Well, I think building on what was said, I mean, some of the things, you do have to have a framework in place. And once you establish those policies and you put that framework in place and you actually make it a living document or a living thing, it can't just be static and sit on the shelf. There's always going to be times when it needs to change, and it really does need to change based on the type of data that you've got out there. And obviously one of the things that we talk about with big data is those inferences you can draw from disparate pieces of data. So for example, this piece of data may be fairly insignificant in itself. This piece of data may be somewhat insignificant. But now when we join them together along with maybe the time that the data was collected or who it was collected from, it becomes very, very important data that in fact has to be protected. So there's multiple things. Obviously you have to protect the data at the most basic level, but you also need to protect that those inferences and the analytics that can be used on that data.
I think that makes sense because I think we can classify data. Some of it we know automatically as private. Social security numbers, credit card numbers, things of that nature, birth dates or whatever, have medical information. But when you start combining what you might not think is sensitive information, you could end up with some interesting...
Well, Clayton, and I think that's key. One of the big issues that we always see time and time again, even through investigative responses and data breaches, back to what Denise said from frameworks and classifications and what Neal said as well, data classification is always up front. Most companies or organizations don't have a handle of what data classification is or what data they have. And if you don't know what data you have, how do you manage it? As Clay stated, you have data that could be, just normal phone book stuff that you don't care if it gets out, or you have the deeper security concerns. But most companies or organizations that we deal with really don't have a handle on that, and that is key. To be able to do any of this, you really need to understand what your data is, how secure you need to be for each component of those data sets, and take it from there. Whether that's big data or on-premise or stored in-house, it doesn't matter. The data is the data, and you need to know what it is.
Sir.
So from a slightly different perspective, when you're applying analytics to non-identifying data, but you can apply the analytics down to, hey, that becomes Joe Smith over in that department, in that organization. How do you manage those things through your analytic tools, or can you manage those things through your analytic tools? So I can take non-identifying data, but I can narrow down the characteristics of who I'm looking, or what data I'm looking at, and I can say, I work for a university, so I can say, oh, that's Professor Joe Smith in the biology department. And I'm not supposed to be able to identify that in this data, but by applying the criteria to the selections, you can narrow that data down to identify individuals where we shouldn't be allowed to.
Well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'll take a high-level approach to that, and this is well known, obviously, is the deprovisioning and provisioning processes that goes along with that as well from a characteristics, because you have people that jump from job to job within the organization, and you need to know what that characteristics is. So that's where tool sets, well, processes and policies obviously play a key role, but that's where tool sets come into play, where you can actually organize that and control kind of what that looks like. I'm a fan of policies and procedures, obviously, but then there comes a point where the tool sets have to come in to be able to help you manage that, because it's not a manual thing that can be done easily. So I said, getting down to the characteristics of the data, that's always a concern because there's so many attributes that are tied to that. It's more about the deprovisioning, provisioning process and the life cycle of that credential or that user to be able to understand what to do with that on a daily basis. Again, that's the high-level approach of that, but it comes down to tool sets, I guess. Denise, did you have any additions to that?
Yeah, and not so much from a tool set related issue. We have a little bit of that as well. Obviously, we take tax information and try to predict what's going to happen to help the government make better decisions about budget related items and so on. And sometimes, even though we have processes and guidelines for how that works, you can end up with a report that basically could be narrowed down to a single taxpayer. So going back to knowing what data you have, understanding how you're going to use it and what your results can be, our research folks that do that work very closely with my disclosure folks. They've been educated on, we understand this is your job. We understand what your business requirements are and what you are expected to deliver to your clients. But we also know this can happen. So our expectation is that you're going to be looking at how you use that data. You're going to look at the reports that you generate, and you're going to apply some rules, guidelines, and so on before we release that information. So that kind of goes back to classifying the data. Is it confidential? Is it not? Is it for public release? Is it not? And then making good business decisions around that. We don't want to stop the business. We just want to help them make good decisions so they do the right thing with that data. And sometimes there are tool sets that will help us do that, and sometimes not. So we still have to apply some of those guidelines. But I want to go back to, again, the policies and procedures are really, really important. But if you don't educate the business that are going to be using your data, it doesn't matter if you have the policies and procedures. So it's really, really important that you have them and that you educate folks on what they are. Not that, I mean, we have a huge information security policy. Do I expect every single employee to know every single provision of that policy? I don't. But what I do expect them to know is that there is a policy. If they have a question, they can go to it. And if they still don't understand it, where to go to get the answers to their questions. So.
Yeah, and I would say, I'm sorry. Yeah, I would just say enforcing as well. As Denise said, you could have a large information security policy, but we time and time again, we see companies that just don't enforce it. They write big policies, but then nobody actually uses it, nobody audits it, and nobody monitors it. Then it just gets out of hand as well.
The problem is the data in aggregate is non-confidential, but when you get down to a single cell, it then becomes confidential. And so we publish rules and policies around that, but we can't take away the reports. They need those reports for a number of areas. So we just have to make sure that they've been trained in the appropriate security policies. For our public-facing, anything that results in a count of less than 5 especially, we just put down less than 5 and we don't tell them how many people are part of the sample size.
Right.
Great example.
And that also starts to drive towards more of the access and authentication process as well. So which we won't touch on that, but we can. That's obviously a key component as well. Who has access to that data? And again, as they move through the organization, are they getting deprovisioned off of that? Do they have the right credentials or not just using a single password? I mean, that goes along with securing big data or just data in general.
Does the Franchise Tax Board use role-based access control to the data?
Yes, we do. It's a requirement when we're building a system that there be role-based access. With that, I'm not going to say that it's always perfect. It's not. We have some old legacy systems where we do have role-based access. Is it what we would like it to be necessarily today? No, but we're constantly making baby steps towards getting it where we need it to be. So I don't want you to leave thinking that if you're not perfect today and if you're not doing all those things today, why even start? That's really not the case. Even large organizations, sometimes things move so fast that we can't keep up, and things change. And so the important thing is to do your risk assessments, figure out where your gaps are, and then figure out how to close those gaps in an order that makes some sense and that you can do, and then just make continuous improvement.
And I'd just like to add something to all this, and those of you who know me know that my mind works a little bit differently than maybe it should. But one of the things I think we have to be cautious about as well is there's a school of thought that says if you collect enough data, you can accurately predict essentially any behavior. And, you know, for those of you who enjoy quantum physics, I don't know if there's many of you, but the whole idea of quantum physics is it's very easy to predict what a group of things will do. You can say this thing will happen, but to be able to predict what a single atom will do is virtually impossible. And so one of the things we need to be cognizant of and obviously cautious of is that we don't make the fallacy. There was a popular movie called Minority Report based on a book by Philip K. Dick. And the idea was you collected all this information and you could predict that somebody was going to commit a crime. And so you could stop it before it happened. And, you know, obviously that's taking it to the extreme, but we need to be cautious that we don't make those same kind of fallacies with our big data installations and the analytics we're running on it. So.
Question over here? Yes.
Yeah, I had a couple questions. One was in light of big data, right, where you bring together different data sets that may never have been analyzed together at the same time. How do you put in place policies and practices around that whole infrastructure? And two, then do you also push some of those policies out in your data sharing? Because when you start sharing data out, do you still retain that ownership of the data, even though it's been combined and turned into a whole different data set, and how do you manage that?
Great multi-part question. I think she's a shill. No. I'm a firm believer that if I collected that data from someone, and I'm going to speak a little bit from a tax perspective, and we'll try to broaden that as we go. So as a taxpayer, and I'll use myself, I give my information to both the Franchise Tax Board and the IRS, and I have an expectation that when I give that to them, that they're going to use it in the manner that they told me they were going to use it. In California, we have our privacy principles that says we only collect the data we need to do our job, we use it in a responsible manner, and if we're going to use it in a different way, we tell you, and so on and so forth. So following that, when I share that data, I don't believe that we lose ownership of it. I believe that we stay the owner of that data as it traverses. And our agreements say that who we share it with, those people can't share it with other people without our consent. And that doesn't really happen. So with that, if they want that data, then to a certain extent, they've got to follow some of those same policies. So you bring up an important point. Do we say that you must follow, in particular, our privacy policies? No, because they're not really applicable. But the protections that we guaranteed the individual when we collected that data, those things need to transfer with it. So when you get to the point where maybe that data is combined and now it's different, if you will, kind of it's hard to get back to that original data source, that's where I think it's important that you have good relationships with the people that you're sharing data with, that you understand how they're using it and what they're doing to it and what the end result is. Going back to the gentleman over here, his question about what do you do when you get down to a report where you can basically identify the individual that comes out on that report. Same kind of thing, understanding how that data is going to be used, talking with your business partner about what their need is and use, and then coming up with good, either a policy change or a practice or an agreement, if you will, on does that still retain that same ownership? Make sense?
Was that both parts of your questions? Did it answer everything? Okay, good. Anything else out there? Sir?
What about when it comes to time when someone uses the Information Act to pull some data that, you know, again, is not private in and of itself, but when you mix it in with their advertising schemes, it changes that data, and they're using old laws to grab new data. How are we going to handle that?
You have more experience on that one than me.
That went. Well, you mentioned the Information Practices Act. That's really more geared towards an individual. And I've got my privacy officer in the audience, so if I get off track too far, she might jump in. But I think what you might really be referring to is the Public Records Act, where anybody can request information. Going back to the earlier conversation on knowing what data you have and knowing what it's classified is really important. There is some data that by its very nature is public information. There are some clauses that allow us to exempt that information from public disclosure based on very specific criteria. So to answer your question, I think there's some data that is just, if it doesn't meet one of those exemptions, it gets released. It's according to the law. But what we do in my organization is that data is, the data requests are filtered through a central organization in my area. They evaluate the requests, they collect the information, and then they apply the statute to make sure that, one, we release the information that should be released, and two, that we protect the information that should be protected. So I'm not sure I'm really answering your question, because they can then take that data and combine it with data that they got from somewhere else. I don't know what I can do about that, or any of you who are data stewards could do about that, because under the very nature of the code by itself, it's got to be released. Some good questions, and might be worth some further conversation about, you know, what that data is, and do we need to look at some law changes as big data gets even bigger. What did they say it was going to grow by double what it is today, or in 2 years or something like that, some crazy figure that they were throwing out this morning at the keynote. So yeah, it's a tough situation.
Yes.
So everything you're talking about takes time. I'm on the user side. I'm also on the data side too. But what's being done or how long does it take for one of these requests to go through? One of our biggest problems is by the time we've met everything, we get this data, it's now a year old. What we're using it for is no longer useful to the people that need it. So we have to start over, and we're back in that queue of waiting for access to some data sets. So probably different at different departments, but we're really struggling with getting the data we need in a timely fashion because of these processes.
Well, I always pass
Count
it.
to 10 first.
I always pass it to Denise because she's got, obviously from the government side, I'm more on the data breach investigative response side. But to answer your question, and I'm sure Denise can probably elaborate on this, but it's around policies and procedures. And I think from the government side and the state side, obviously things take a little longer to happen. How do you fix that? I mean, in the corporate public sector world, we always do it by eliminating, or I should say auditing, policies and procedures and seeing what's working, what's not working, and kind of making sure that we're doing the right things to go as fast as possible. From the government side, I mean, that's probably a little different because you guys have more regulations that require other aspects that need to be identified and reviewed before that happens. So I would say just review of current processes and seeing if there's anywhere that they can be shortened. It sounds like a simple answer, but for most companies, that's really key, is they've got so many processes from just, migrating different companies together or other things that have occurred that just have grown. The simple processes of onboarding or getting reports have just gone out of control, and people just keep adding to it instead of looking at it and say, okay, how do we reduce it? That's key to making sure that you can get the reports faster. But again, I mean, is that?
And I just have to play devil's advocate here. The very fact that it takes so long, in some ways, helps to address the freedom of information question that was asked earlier, because it does make the information a little less valuable, a little less pertinent. Not that anybody would ever do that on purpose. I'm not suggesting that, but you know, it is, in some ways, it helps with not releasing information so quickly that it can be used in a detrimental way.
I'm curious, were you dealing with internal or external data sources?
Oh.
Both, and for
We
the.
collect internal data that we need to link to outside data that we need to get from other departments.
Is it the inside data or the outside data you're having problems with?
Oh, the outside data.
Okay.
That we are held up getting. And we're very well, because we also send out our data, so we're aware of the issues, but we struggle to get what we need to complete our mandates in a time that.
Right. So what my co-panelists have said is on point, and you do have to re-examine your policies and procedures to make sure that they really work, because let's face it, if the business customer doesn't get what they need in order to accomplish their goals, because you know, my goal as a chief security officer, data protector is one thing, their goal is to get the data and get the results back out so that they can do their job. I need to understand that. And if I want them to help me achieve my goals, I need to help them achieve their goals. And so it's really important to build relationships, and things don't always move quickly in the state, and even if you have the best policies and procedures within your own department, maybe the one that you're working with is not quite at the same maturity level. So that relationship thing that I talked about, inside and understanding your business, highly encourage you to meet with those people that you share data with on a regular basis. We have a joint data sharing team that our privacy officer and my disclosure staff are participant on with the other big state agencies that we regularly share data with. They discuss those issues and come up with new ideas, or how are we going to do this, or this is coming up and how are we going to get through that, and share ideas about what they have and how to make things better, and so on and so forth. So again, as much as you understand, I just kind of talked about understanding what you're doing in your organization with your data and how you need to use it, maybe understanding the partner that you're going to be sharing with or getting data from is just as important, so that you can help speed up that process and you help each other.
So does anybody in the audience want to throw out what they see as their biggest problems from securing NoSQL databases to securing endpoints, data encryption?
So, with big data, of course, there's a lot of data come over time to be able to display the data in user application and fast management, right? So one of the challenges we have is, I guess the question is, for confidential data, to be able to protect those data, in terms of encryption data during transit as well as address. I'd just like to know what is the best way to encrypt data for those kind of security protection, at the same time providing fast access to the user application and stuff like that.
I could do that one too.
And I'll let these guys talk about it too, but one of the things I was just going to make as an observation, I think you bring up a really critical issue, and that's how do you balance that need for security with the usability? And it's true in big data, but it's true in security in general. You can make a system so secure that no one can use it. And obviously you can't do that. So I think there's not any one single answer to it, but it's really going to be dependent upon how the data is classified and what the criticality is of that system. And it goes back to confidentiality, integrity of the data, and availability. And those are all critically important. And I'll be quiet now and let these guys talk.
No, that's all right. Perfect. So I'll just add to that, and that from what we see, encrypting data is easy. I mean, there's a lot of regulations, and I'm sure from the state level and the government and corporate level. standards and policies around encryption. I mean, we can encrypt PKI, we can, you know, whatever we need to do. Encryption's not the issue. Typically, the issues that we run into is that the misuse of access, the misuse of passwords, the ways that people get in from social engineering, the misuse, hacking, phishing, it all comes down to the end user and how they're using their credential to get into that information. You know, you could step back and say, hey, I've encrypted this thing so nobody can break in, but somebody will find a back door, and that back door is usually access controls or some password-related issue or some phishing scam or hacking scam that's got you in. So, I mean, that's what we need to be concerned about. I mean, we can encrypt data back and forth without an issue. I mean, there's great algorithms out there that do that. But if you go back and look at like any of the data breaches from 2012 or even before, time and time again, it's always at the top of the list. There's always social engineering, misuse, hacking, phishing, things like that. Encryption, whether that's big data, whether that's in-house, on-prem, yeah, everybody kind of looks at it and says, how do I encrypt this? How do I do this? Yes, we can do that, but you got to step back and look at the big picture and say, how are my users accessing it? What are their credentials to access it? Are we giving them the education that they need to be able to use their credentials correctly? Are we doing auditing and logging and monitoring on those credentials, those users? I think that's probably the biggest key to making sure you're securing your data.
Yeah, we brought out copies of our data breach investigations report. That's sitting on the chair in the back, and you're welcome to take a copy on the way out. I think it points out that over 80% of the breaches are caused by the misuse of access. And a mitigating factor is definitely your two-factor authentication. So take a look at that, take a copy of that. Yes, sir.
So I'm not going to disagree that we have a lot of data, and that going through and trying to classify all the data that you currently have in any infrastructure is just going to be a monumental task. But do you guys have a cookbook or a checklist that you've developed internally from this point on for whatever project that you try to classify that data just to help set the rules in place?
Yes, and we use that methodology various ways. So in our organization, you know, and many of you from state government, probably local county governments, have the same thing. You have legacy systems. When those legacy systems were first built, we weren't dealing with the issues that we're dealing with today, right? So we kind of have a policy, no matter what it is, no matter what arena it is, whether it's the security of the system or categorizing data or whatever it may be, that when you make a major modification or when you build a new system, you have to build to current best practices all the way around. Now you might be saying, okay, she just said they only do it when they have a major system upgrade. What if they don't ever have a major system upgrade and they have a major hole? Well, we're big on risk assessments in my organization. Going back to the lady in the back, her comment about sometimes it takes so long. They can't take that long. They have to be fairly quick. You have to have a repeatable process. But I love risk assessments because it gets the business area to say, here's what my business problem is, and here's, you know, some of the things about how I think I might solve it. And it gives us an opportunity to talk about what the risks are around that. And then it's back on both of our plates. Are we willing to accept the risk to achieve the business goal that we believe that we need to achieve? And so we apply some of those risk assessments to those big gaps in our legacy systems, even if they aren't making big changes, to figure out where, again, our big gaps are so that we make some improvements along the way. But one good way is, as you build something new or make a major modification, they have to bring it up to current standard, kind of like a building code concept, right? Doesn't mean you don't change some other things. If your wall in your house has got dry rot, you fix it, right? And then you deal with it. So same thing with your legacy systems.
Well, and building on that, one of the other things that we haven't really talked about today, but it's critical, especially in big data, and that is constant monitoring of what's happening out there. So yes, if you've got dry rot in your house, you need to fix it, but finding that dry rot early and quickly is critical, because the longer, whether it's a breach or like we're saying dry rot in a house, the longer it goes on, the worse the damage is. So identifying it quickly and being able to respond quickly is really critical.
There's a question over here. One more question. Oh, sorry, didn't see that.
For multi-factor authentication, what have you found now that it's matured a bit, that gets you kind of the best bang for your buck, but still some level of manageability? For example, you know, hard tokens are great, but once your number of users start really growing, they're very difficult to manage and whatnot. Okay, go to a soft token, some form that's sent onto your phone. Well, nowadays people probably track their phone much more than they used to in the past. So what are you finding, especially for organizations that are getting larger, the groups that they're having to manage authentication for larger, what are you finding to be a nice kind of middle ground for multi-factor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I see within our own organization, we've moved away from hard tokens. We all started with hard tokens and realized they're too expensive, they get lost, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we first moved to soft tokens, which was nice, but now we're actually moving to another level where you can use any device to authenticate you as your second factor. My phone, it has been shown in your phone, you will miss it within 4 minutes. You know, so you will always, and if you use that as your second factor device, then that's a huge piece of that two-factor. Plus, you can do soft tokens, you can do SMS, you can do IVR, where it calls you back. You can do QR codes, where you just scan it over. Maybe a bank presents a QR code on you that's automatically generated. You scan it with your phone. You either have to enter a PIN. All this is available to you now, and this is technology that's definitely available, and definitely moving toward carrying your own device as your second factor.
Just to add to that, user acceptance, that's key. We always see people want to move from passwords to multi-factor or even second factor. Getting the user base to move from that is always a challenge. So hard tokens are still prevalent, and that's really around privileged access management, like users that have to get access to sensitive systems. They don't have, typically they carry a soft token for their normal day-to-day stuff, and then they have a hard token that they must carry for their privileged access, super access stuff. So there is a role there for hard tokens still. And then also some policies that I've seen in large companies, oil companies, financials, they still write in their policies that they require hard tokens for specific things. But I think it gets back to user acceptance. If you want to start rolling out things to end users, pretty much everybody carries a phone, so soft tokens is going to be the route. Hard tokens are a good choice as well, but they start to get expensive because you have to ship them, you have to manage them, monitor them, which is not as easy as the soft tokens. So there has been a big shift over the last year or 2 years to move from that hard token philosophy to the soft tokens. But user acceptance is always the challenge, because depending on the corporation, you may have people that are very computer savvy, and you have some people that are just like, I don't want to touch a computer, and then you hand them a smartphone with a soft token and they just go bonkers. So I guess it comes down to just looking at each individual organization and saying what's the best fit for your user base. And I would say most of the time it's going to the soft token route, or as we started introducing new universal identity services, which is, as Clay was talking about, you can have multiple access points or token points, where it's your smartphone, it could be your IVR, it could be your Gmail account, it could be anything. And then that just gives you multiple authentication points where you can say, hey, I left my phone at home and I'm at work, how do I access the network now? Well, I just log into Gmail and we send you an SMS code, or an SMS with a code, and or an email with a code, and you guys log in that way. So that's a deeper conversation, but we can, that's the way things are moving right now. Yes?
Are you finding much value in adding, let's call it a third factor that I've noticed my banks in particular are doing, where they're saying, oh, is this a public computer, or do you want to register this as a commonly used computer, so that we're going to allow you, it still appears to me that there's a factoring that, but we're going to kind of allow you to skip getting security questions or typing in type what you see on the screen or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And in terms of, I would imagine there's great value, but in terms of the implementation, are you finding that it's worth?
Well, from an implementation, I mean, if you're looking to do it in-house, that's quite the challenge. Typically, for most companies, it's a managed outsource to do that. And what you're talking about is kind of the geographic location and some of the risk analysis around, you know, if you're on your phone and you just logged in from California, and then, you know, 15 minutes later you logged in from New York, obviously there's an issue there. So, yeah, it plays a role, and mostly in the financial industry, because they're starting to look at that and go, okay, how do we start to look at that and say, is this user where they're supposed to be from, you know, where their phone is located? So there's always some issues around that, but as far as doing it in-house, I wouldn't recommend doing it in-house, just because there's a lot of challenges around it. It has been done. It has been done successfully, but success is usually not what the end game is for most companies, which is the end result.
I saw a question right here.
Going back to your question about using soft tokens or using the endpoint device as an authenticator, I can see that as like something static, but to use that as a two-factor authentication, my understanding of it is it's authenticating the user, not necessarily the device. Because it could raise a lot of questions of, well, did your laptop get stolen? And God forbid, we're going back to the same issue that we faced for years and years. And user practice of, if they say the password, granted not in a sticky anymore because that's been a joke for a long time, but people do things like that. So there's a split, and I'm kind of curious as to how your organization, I mean, is it general data that people are able to get to, or, you know, when you use soft token authentication, because if I use this and I have a soft token in here, you're using the same device to read that other factor. So I'm struggling with that.
Well, we also have policies on our phones that just you get into the phone to get to the soft token, you know, it's controlled by a good process, right? I'm not making I don't work for good. I'm not trying to sell you good, but that's just who we use. There's two things about that. One is, like I said, you'll miss your phone within 4 minutes, or roughly, and you'll report it. Okay, so then we can revoke access from that system. You're gonna call somebody and say, I lost my phone, right? Because you can't make a call, you can't get your email, whatever. So you're likely to report that much quicker than even your laptop, for one thing. The second thing, and then as I said, you control access from that soft token because it's usually controlled by some sort of a password. So there's two things that are going to work for you in that respect. Keeping that as your second factor. If I lose my hard token, well, maybe I'll report it tomorrow. I don't care. I'm not logging in today. But I need to make a phone call later.
Just to add to that as well, there's also a level of assurance or the LOAs, which means that you as an end user may only be an LOA 2, which means that you just need to put in your PIN and then get your passcode, which if you lost your phone and somebody had your passcode, they wouldn't have your PIN, so you couldn't log in. It's just like an ATM. But if you had an LOA 3, like a doctor or somebody that had higher privileges, they would have multiple channels that they'd have to go through to be able to access whatever they need to do, whether that be medical records or prescribing class 3 drugs, anything. So that's what happens. So you're not just getting a code and saying, hey, type this in. Like the RSA tokens, they have, here's a token, you can type that in. If you lost it, somebody has your token, they can type it in, depending on how it's configured. Typically in the smartphone world or the token world for soft tokens, it's based on LOAs. So depending on what LOA you are, it determines how many channels you have of authentication that need to occur. So it's getting more sophisticated, but also as an end user, it's getting harder to get into things, which is good if you look at kind of like all the data breaches and what's occurred. But yeah, so I don't know. Did that help answer your question?
I was just
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
We have to wrap up this session. Time is up, but I thank everybody for coming today and listening to us.
I would like to add something that the 3 Verizon specialists will be at the booth for about the next hour, and then they have to catch flights back home. So if you want to continue to have any more questions, please join us at our booth just past the registration desk. Thank you, panel, very, very much.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you.